When people recall Henry VIII's children, they often think of the merciless Bloody Mary or the illustrious Elizabeth I. But there was another heir, one whose short-lived rule would expose a darkness so deep, even his infamous father might have recoiled. Edward VI, the child king who ascended the throne at just 9 years old, would evolve from a seemingly pure boy into one of England's most hardline rulers, before facing an end so grim it would cast a shadow over the Tudor line forever. This isn't just the tale of a frail boy who died too soon. It's a chilling reminder that absolute power can warp even the youngest of minds. What unfolded in Edward's final days will upend everything you believed about the Tudors. In 1537, Henry VIII finally received what he had longed for, a legitimate son. Edward's birth was hailed across the realm as the solution to years of dynastic instability. Yet his arrival came at a heartbreaking price. His mother, Jane Seymour, passed away only 12 days after giving birth, leaving the infant prince without a mother, and making him all the more cherished by his increasingly suspicious father. From the moment he was born, Edward was not treated like a typical child, but as the nation's great hope, constantly surrounded by guards, scholars, and nobles who reminded him daily of his sacred purpose. This detachment from ordinary childhood would mark the beginning of a much darker transformation. Unlike Mary and Elizabeth, who had both felt the sting of their father's rejection and fury, Edward experienced only admiration and indulgence. Perhaps to make up for his mistreatment of his daughters, Henry VIII lavished affection on his son, to the point of near deification. The young prince received the finest instruction money could secure, but these were no ordinary educators. They were fervent Protestant thinkers, handpicked to shape Edward into the ultimate Protestant monarch. By the age of 6, Edward's lessons included not just classical languages, but intense religious studies condemning Catholicism and asserting the divine authority of Protestant kings. Henry VIII hadn't merely given his son an education, he had orchestrated an ideological conditioning. Edward's lead tutor, John Cheek, though a brilliant intellectual, was also a devout zealot who filled the boy's imagination with visions of a purified England free from Catholic stain. Every subject, from history to governance, was taught through a rigid lens of Protestant dominance and royal infallibility. By 8, Edward could articulate detailed religious justifications for why Catholics deserved execution and why opposing him in the future would be no different from defying God himself. What made Edward's upbringing especially perilous was its fusion of scholarly depth with utter emotional detachment. While he could argue doctrine with seasoned academics, he had never shared a game with peers or known the warmth of genuine human connection. His world consisted solely of adults who venerated him, cultivating a boy who grasped political theory with precision, yet had no understanding of compassion or the sanctity of human life. This dangerous mix of exceptional intellect and emotional underdevelopment would come to shape every element of his rule. In the fall of 1547, England was placed under the authority of a 9-year-old child who had been raised to believe he was God's divine representative on earth. Edward VI took the throne after the death of his father, Henry VIII, and with it he inherited not only the crown, but a realm fractured by intense religious conflict. The boy king had been shaped by the most uncompromising Protestant educators his father could find, men who filled his mind with dreams of pure religious purity and unchallenged dominance. In contrast to his elder sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both endured the fury of their father, Edward had been protected, idolized, and constantly reminded of his destined greatness. This fusion of holy authority and childish impulsivity would prove disastrous for countless subjects. The kingdom Edward came to rule was a tinderbox of religious discord. Though his father had severed ties with the Pope and established the Church of England, the nation was still bitterly split between Catholics, moderate reformers, and radical Protestants. At first, Edward's Regency Council, led by his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, appeared to promise balanced leadership, but the young monarch had his own vision for ruling the land. Even in his earliest council sessions, Edward exhibited an unsettling blend of bratty arrogance and icy determination, often interrupting seasoned advisors to deliver lessons on Protestant theology. What stood out to those present was how swiftly the 9-year-old began to assert his will. Just weeks after his coronation, Edward was reviewing capital cases himself and displaying a chilling enthusiasm for the executions of those labeled heretics. Official records from this time depict a boy who treated executions as academic exercises, calmly debating the religious grounds for punishment with the same detachment he showed when discussing Latin syntax. Witnesses noted that Edward frequently smiled as he signed off on death warrants, seemingly satisfied with his clever use of scripture to justify each sentence. The early part of Edward's reign was characterized by what his courtiers quietly referred to as religious tantrums, intense outbursts whenever anyone proposed a more moderate approach to faith. Edward had so thoroughly absorbed his instructor's teachings that he sincerely believed any concession to Catholicism was a direct betrayal of Christ. When one advisor recommended allowing certain Catholic nobles to worship privately, Edward reportedly hurled his inkwell at the man and shouted that England would face divine punishment for such cowardice. At first, many brushed these episodes off as childish outbursts, but they soon revealed the emergence of a true religious extremist. Perhaps most troubling was Edward's complete lack of ordinary childhood interests. While most boys his age played games or explored the outdoors, Edward spent his leisure time reading about the Spanish Inquisition and taking careful notes on interrogation tactics. His personal attendants reported discovering drawings in his room that depicted torture devices, accompanied by Edward's handwritten thoughts on their effectiveness in extracting confessions from suspected heretics. Instead of learning to joust or hunt, Edward was focused on studying the most brutal methods of breaking people's wills in the name of religious purity. What made Edward especially dangerous was the way his religious zealotry was paired with unchecked royal authority. While those around him schemed for power, the young king eagerly absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings. He kept meticulous journals of his reign, and these writings reveal a child who took delight in documenting executions, religious crackdowns, and the suffering of those he viewed as enemies of the faith. By the time he turned 10, Edward was personally writing sermons that were read out loud in churches throughout England, sermons that demanded the total eradication of Catholic influence and warned of God's wrath for anyone who showed compassion to heretics. Edward's cruelty extended well beyond the realm of religion. He showed a vindictive side that shocked even the seasoned courtiers who had once served his ruthless father. When household staff angered him, Edward devised elaborate punishments clearly intended more for humiliation than correction. One young page who spilled wine on Edward's documents was made to stand outside for hours, while others pelted him with rotten food, an ordeal planned entirely by the 11-year-old monarch. Edward watched these punishments unfold with visible satisfaction, often taking notes on the reactions of the victims as if conducting experiments. His journal entries from this time portray a mind drifting further from basic human empathy. He described the pain and terror of others with the same emotionless tone he used to comment on the weather, treating suffering as a subject of intellectual curiosity. When a kitchen maid died after being whipped on Edward's command for allegedly saying Catholic prayers, the young king's only written remark was that the punishment had been more effective than expected in preventing further error. Edward's behavior towards his own family may offer the clearest glimpse into his deepening emotional detachment. Though he had spent his early years alongside his sisters, once he became king, Edward showed no warmth towards Mary or Elizabeth. Instead, he judged them solely through his religious worldview. Mary was a threat, a devoted Catholic who needed to be suppressed or removed. Elizabeth, while not ideal, was tolerable because her Protestant leanings made her somewhat more acceptable. For Edward, family bonds were meaningless next to political and religious calculations. The shift in Edward's character became even clearer when his uncle Thomas Seymour tried to win his favor with gifts and flattery. Rather than responding with gratitude, Edward interpreted Thomas's gestures as manipulation and answered with calculated coldness. When Thomas was arrested for treason, Edward not only backed his execution, but reportedly watched from a window as the man who had once shown him kindness was taken to the scaffold. Eyewitnesses claimed the young king displayed no emotion as the axe struck, instead jotting down notes in his journal, analyzing the efficiency of various execution methods. As Edward reached the age of 12, his autocratic streak intensified sharply. The boy, once seen as delicate and scholarly, began taking direct command of national policy, often overturning his advisors' decisions when he deemed them too soft. His Protestant reforms took on an increasingly harsh tone, with enforced church attendance monitored by a network of informants and harsh punishments for any divergence from sanctioned beliefs. Edward himself crafted a system of religious oversight so thorough that it rivaled the Spanish Inquisition, encouraging citizens to spy on one another and offering rewards to children who reported their parents' religious offenses. The king's desire for total control extended deep into private religious practice. Edward issued rigid directives not just on public worship, but on personal prayer, dictating how his subjects were to worship, what they were to believe, and even how they were to conceive of God. Any breach of these directives was treated as both treason against the monarchy and blasphemy against the divine, with consequences ranging from public disgrace to imprisonment to death. Edward personally reviewed each case, often intensifying the proposed punishments on the grounds that they lacked sufficient fervor for Protestant reform. He created what amounted to a religious surveillance state, encouraging people to report the spiritual behavior of their neighbors, with incentives for successful accusations. The young monarch took personal interest in reading these accounts, and would often call the informants to court to provide more detailed testimonies against the accused. Those convicted of harboring Catholic beliefs were subjected to imprisonment, torture, or execution, with Edward himself frequently increasing the severity of their penalties. His court became a space where religious hysteria and mutual suspicion flourished, while clemency was treated as a sign of weakness. The persecution machinery Edward constructed was extraordinary in its systematic approach and in the king's personal involvement. Unlike older monarchs who might delegate such grim duties, Edward insisted on examining every file himself, studying the accusations closely and tailoring the punishments to fit what he saw as each heretic's specific spiritual failing. His diaries from this time resemble handbooks of religious oppression, packed with reflections on which punishments worked best for different doctrinal violations. What made Edward's campaign of persecution especially disturbing was the way he combined youthful imagination with lethal purpose. When traditional forms of punishment didn't seem sufficient, the adolescent king would invent new forms of disgrace and torment, always justified with dense theological reasoning. One Catholic priest who refused to abandon his faith was made to march through the streets of London, carrying a placard reading "Enemy of Christ," while children hurled stones at him, all under Edward's explicit command. The king reportedly observed the scene from his palace window, laughing as the priest suffered, and dictating notes to his secretary. Edward's relentless drive for religious conformity extended into his family, exposing a complete absence of natural emotional connection. He viewed his half-sister Mary, a steadfast Catholic, not as a sibling, but as the most severe threat to his vision of a Protestant England. Surviving personal letters show Edward speaking of Mary with a venom that was both juvenile and deeply unsettling, calling her the bastard and Christ's enemy, while scheming to declare her illegitimate or even execute her for heresy. The boy who should have felt some familiar loyalty instead fantasized about watching his sister burn for her faith. Edward's loathing for Mary surpassed strategic politics. It appeared to devour him with a personal obsession that alarmed even his most extreme supporters. He spent long hours constructing scenarios that would legally eliminate Mary from the succession, working closely with Protestant legal minds eager to provide justification for what was essentially the murder of his own sister. Members of the court observed that Edward's mood soured whenever Mary was mentioned, and he would often retreat to his quarters to compose angry diatribes about the religious necessity of removing her from the royal line. The king's schemes for dealing with Mary grew more elaborate and brutal over time. Edward composed detailed plans for her arrest, interrogation, and execution, with complete invented charges of treason and heresy. He even drafted a forced confession for her to sign, a document in which she would renounce her Catholicism and admit to being illegitimate, after which she would be granted a quick beheading instead of being burned alive. These papers, preserved in the royal archives, expose a mind that had crossed from political ruthlessness into outright sociopathic rage. Edward's attitude towards Elizabeth was more complicated, though no less alarming.
While he appreciated her Protestant loyalties, he mainly regarded his younger sister as a pawn to be used for advancing his religious goals. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a way to solidify Protestant alliances, giving little thought to her personal well-being. Even his more favorable views of Elizabeth were shaped entirely by his religious agenda, revealing that her worth to him was purely strategic. The king's failure to form genuine familial bonds extended beyond his relatives and into the wider court. Edward saw his nobles, advisors, and servants not as people with intrinsic value, but mere tools to be manipulated in service of his religious and political ambitions. Even those who had served him loyally for years could find themselves cast aside or executed if they failed to display absolute commitment to his increasingly radical agenda. Allegiance to Edward required total compliance with his vision of a Protestant England, leaving no space for individual conscience or moral hesitation. When Edward began to exhibit serious signs of illness in early 1553, his conduct grew even more unpredictable and cruel. Instead of mellowing in the face of death, the 15-year-old monarch became fixated on guaranteeing that his Protestant reforms would endure after his passing. Aware that Mary's Ascension would spell the return of Catholicism, this prospect pushed him to take ever more extreme actions. The idea that his life's work might be undone by his Catholic sister filled him with a near-maniacal rage, driving him to consider actions that would have shocked even his most ruthless supporters. Rather than tempering his fanaticism, Edward's deteriorating health seemed to intensify it. As his body weakened, his religious obsession only deepened, as though he were attempting to compress an entire lifetime of Protestant purification into his final months. Doctors at court reported that the king's illness brought on bouts of feverish preaching, where he delivered disjointed sermons about eradicating Catholicism, even if it required slaughtering every Catholic in England. While these outbursts were initially written off as fever-induced delirium, Edward's clear-headed intervals made it obvious that his extreme declarations stemmed from genuine conviction, not just sickness. Edward started holding secret meetings with radical Protestants, conspiring to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey. The scheme that unfolded was staggering in both its boldness and cruelty, encompassing plans to detain or kill both of his sisters and install a puppet government ruled by Protestant extremists. Despite his declining strength, the 15-year-old king immersed himself in these conspiratorial meetings with a fervor that astonished and alarmed his fellow plotters. The intricacies of Edward's final plan fully exposed his descent from a seemingly innocent boy to a would-be despot. Partnering with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward devised a strategy that would lead to the execution of both his sisters and the creation of a Protestant regime more fanatical than anything England had previously known. The plot included plans for mass executions of Catholic aristocrats, the wholesale confiscation of Catholic properties, and the founding of a permanent religious police tasked with monitoring every facet of daily life. Edward's direct engagement in orchestrating these brutal measures was both meticulous and fervent. In his final weeks, the dying king filled page after page with lists of Catholics marked for death, properties scheduled for seizure, and laws to be enacted in his envisioned Protestant utopia. His handwriting, increasingly unsteady due to his illness, covered sheet after sheet with blueprints for what amounted to religious extermination. The boy, once thought to be a helpless pawn in court politics, revealed himself as the mastermind behind a plan that would have rendered the Spanish Inquisition lenient by comparison. But Edward's affliction delivered a cruel twist that many saw as divine irony for the horrors he had planned. Modern analyses suggest that the young monarch suffered from a mix of tuberculosis and likely arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own doctors in a misguided treatment attempt. Observers at the time were not blind to the irony. The king who had poisoned his nation with sectarian hatred was now being literally poisoned by those attempting to heal him. As the poison slowly ravaged his body, he began experiencing hallucinations and periods of insanity, which his courtiers interpreted as divine visions. The boy who had shown no pity to others endured his last weeks in unbearable pain, his body writhing in torment as it gradually gave out. The king's suffering only seemed to fan the flames of his religious fervor, offering him no spiritual peace, but instead feeding his obsessions. The circumstances of Edward's death were especially horrifying to those present. His doctors noted that a foul stench emanated from his body weeks before the end, and his skin developed a greenish cast suggestive of extreme poisoning. His hair and nails fell out, and he was racked by violent seizures that temporarily paralyzed him. The child once regarded as the most handsome of Henry VIII's offspring became a grotesque shadow of his former self, as though his own body rebelled against the poisons consuming him. Perhaps most chilling of all, Edward retained enough awareness to grasp what was happening, spending his final days swinging between screams of physical anguish and frenzied monologues about Protestant martyrs. His last coherent conversations made no mention of forgiveness or reconciliation, but instead expressed sorrow that he would not live to complete England's religious purification. The dying king urged his conspirators to carry out the plan without him, assuring them that God would bless their efforts to establish a Protestant haven. Edward's final moments were a dark distortion of a typical deathbed scene. Rather than asking for mercy or expressing love for his kin, he used his last breath to denounce his Catholic sister and beg God to shield Protestant England from what he called Mary's evil. Those who witnessed his passing reported that his last words were filled not with peace but with hatred, a fitting conclusion to a life consumed by religious zealotry and political extremism. When Edward died on July 6, 1553, the sense of relief among his courtiers was unmistakable, though few dared to voice it openly. The boy king who once promised salvation for England had instead become its tormentor, and his death marked the only possible end to a reign of increasingly fanatical policies that had pushed the nation to the brink of civil war. Even Edward's most loyal allies privately conceded that his passing might have been a blessing for England, though none would have dared to voice such opinions out loud.
The immediate fallout from his death made clear how deeply his meticulously crafted plans relied entirely on his personal authority. Lacking the king's relentless will, the conspiracy unraveled within days as more moderate Protestants withdrew from what they now saw as a dangerous extremist agenda. Lady Jane Grey, who had been designated as Edward's successor, suddenly found herself abandoned as nobles who had once appeared dedicated to the Protestant cause now conveniently found pressing obligations elsewhere. Mary's successful claim to the throne was backed not only by Catholics, but also by moderate Protestants appalled by the extremism Edward's rule had exposed. The young king, who had aspired to become the great Protestant hero of England, instead ensured that his legacy would be defined by cruelty and the collective relief at his demise. Even devout Protestants came to view Catholic Mary as a more tolerable choice than the continuation of Protestant radicalism. The tragic irony of Edward's life reaches far beyond his thwarted plans for succession. The boy monarch who had been so fixated on eradicating Catholicism ended up reinforcing it through his own excesses. His purge of moderate reformers had left English Protestantism in the grip of zealots who alienated everyday believers rather than drawing them in. By the time of his death, a significant number of English Protestants had started to see Catholicism as a haven from the increasingly oppressive demands of Edward's brand of religious reform. Contemporary historians have begun to reassess Edward VI's rule, and the emerging portrait is far bleaker than the traditional view of a frail child manipulated by power-hungry advisors. Official records and private letters reveal a youth who took real pleasure in persecution and exhibited unsettling signs of finding satisfaction in the suffering of others. Edward's personal hand in orchestrating executions and his meticulously kept notes detailing torture methods imply that England was governed for 6 years by what can only be described as a child psychopath wielding unrestrained authority. The evolution of Edward from innocent youth to merciless autocrat offers a grim insight into how absolute power can twist the mind. In contrast to adult rulers who may retain some empathy or strategic awareness, Edward's complete detachment from ordinary human relationships, paired with his unwavering belief in divine right, formed the perfect breeding ground for cruelty. The boy who was never denied anything and who believed opposition to his will was inherently sinful became capable of horrors that startled even the violent world of Tudor politics. Accounts from the time suggest that those around Edward were increasingly alarmed by his conduct, yet felt powerless to challenge him. The very ideology that legitimized his reign also rendered any resistance akin to heresy, preventing even his closest confidants from curbing his escalating extremism. The child king had built a system in which his every whim became law, and his intensifying appetite for brutality could only be stopped by death. Perhaps the most unsettling question is what might have occurred had Edward survived into adulthood. His envisioned Protestant England featured a permanent religious police, the total removal of Catholic nobility, and a surveillance state overseeing every detail of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these ambitions in miniature, and there is little doubt that a mature Edward VI would have constructed one of the most repressive regimes in history. The legacy of Edward VI stands as a sobering example that evil can arise from the most unexpected sources, and that well-meaning goals can be distorted by unchecked power and religious extremism. The young king who believed he was rescuing England's soul came dangerously close to destroying its very foundation, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his rule ever granted the realm. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of combining total authority with ideological conviction, especially when such power rests in the hands of someone too immature to grasp the weight of their decisions. Edward's life also highlights the dangerous nexus of youth, power, and dogma. While adult tyrants might retain some empathy or strategic awareness, Edward's complete detachment from ordinary human relationships, paired with his unwavering belief in divine right, formed the perfect breeding ground for cruelty. The boy who was never denied anything and who believed opposition to his will was inherently sinful became capable of horrors that startled even the violent world of Tudor politics. Accounts from the time suggest that those around Edward were increasingly alarmed by his conduct, yet felt powerless to challenge him. The very ideology that legitimized his reign also rendered any resistance akin to heresy, preventing even his closest confidants from curbing his escalating extremism. The child king had built a system in which his every whim became law, and his intensifying appetite for brutality could only be stopped by death. Perhaps the most unsettling question is what might have occurred had Edward survived into adulthood. His envisioned Protestant England featured a permanent religious police, the total removal of Catholic nobility, and a surveillance state overseeing every detail of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these ambitions in miniature, and there is little doubt that a mature Edward VI would have constructed one of the most repressive regimes in history. The legacy of Edward VI stands as a sobering example that evil can arise from the most unexpected sources, and that well-meaning goals can be distorted by unchecked power and religious extremism. The young king who believed he was rescuing England's soul came dangerously close to destroying its very foundation, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his rule ever granted the realm. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of combining total authority with ideological conviction, especially when such power rests in the hands of someone too immature to grasp the weight of their decisions. Edward's life also highlights the dangerous nexus of youth, power, and dogma. While adult tyrants might be tempered by diplomacy or emotional ties, Edward's isolation and unwavering belief in his own righteousness made him capable of envisioning atrocities that even seasoned power brokers found horrifying. The child who should have been playing with toys was instead devising mass killings and religious purges, reducing human lives to disposable elements in his drive for spiritual purity. His reign also reveals how education can devolve into indoctrination when it lacks compassion and perspective. Edward's tutors had cultivated a brilliant theologian, but a moral void, someone capable of justifying cruelty through theology, yet entirely unacquainted with empathy. His story offers a stark reminder of the danger in any system of learning that values doctrinal correctness above fundamental human kindness. Ultimately, Edward VI's short reign emerges as one of the most chilling demonstrations of how power can distort innocence. The boy once seen as Henry VIII's treasured heir became so feared that his death was met with quiet celebration by his people. His shift from sheltered prince to aspiring despot exposes unsettling truths about human nature and the unique threat posed by those who believe their brutality serves a sacred mission.
Edward VI's death signaled not just the end of a life, but the collapse of what might have been England's darkest destiny. The young king's final suffering, writhing in agony and seething in hatred for his own kin, served as a fitting close to a reign that had once inspired hope but delivered only dread. In dying while still young, Edward VI may have unintentionally done his greatest service to the country he claimed to cherish, sparing it from the full realization of his grim ambitions.